Okay, The Courage of the Truth. Lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1983-84. Lecture number 4, given on 22nd February, 1984, the first hour. For certain reasons, because it is true, some people have asked me, I am not going to talk about the cynics today, but next week. I would like instead to make a link between what I was telling you last week with regard to Socrates and the Apology, and what I will tell you next week with regard to the cynics. That is to say, I will speak to you about the lash. Before this, a short comment concerning, first, what I was telling you about Dumézil's book, and second, the mission of epimelia and the root of this word. The two things are directly linked, moreover, since it concerns Dumézil. I have had this question in mind. What is the root of this series of terms I have spoken about on several occasions? There is the word melo, which you find above all in the impersonal form of me, moi, I care about, or more precisely, it concerns me, since it is impersonal, and then a whole series of other words. The noun epimelia, the verb epimelene or epimeliste, the adjective amelis, careless, the adverb amelos, carelessly, and the noun epimeletes, the person who cares for, who looks after, and which often has a fairly precise meaning in Greek institutions. It is a quasi-official responsibility of being the supervisor of something. At any rate, the term may refer to a precise responsibility. Where does this series of words come from? The root itself is clear, but what does it refer to? I am completely incompetent in this domain, so I turned to Dumézil. I asked him what this probably Indo-European root mel was. His first answer was, we don't know. We have no information which allows us to give a signification, a value to this root. And he said straight away, obviously, we might think of melos, that is to say the word found in melodia, which signifies song, rhythmic singing, music. But it is clear that there can be no relation between this melos and the small root mel found in epimelia, mele, moi, etc. This was the point I had reached when, yesterday, he sent me a short note to tell me, I have checked in the Shentrain, the dictionary of Greek roots, and there is no plausible etymology for epimelia, melie, moi, etc. Then he says, I had an idea, wild at first, and which took hold in my mind. Should we really rule out the relation to melos as I did the other day? It would be something like, it appeals to me, ça me chante, with a different orientation towards care and duty. The call of duty instead of freedom and pleasure. That is to say, our expression, it appeals to me, ça me chante, refers in fact to something which is not in the realm of duty, but in the realm of pleasure, of freedom. I do it because it appeals to me, but nevertheless, we may very well conceive of an it appeals to me, which would refer instead to something in your head, which gets into your head, stays in your mind, obsesses you up to a point, and which appeals to you, but in the form of an order, an injunction, a duty to be performed. And he adds that we could find a parallel case from Latin. In Latin, there is the verb camere, which means being hot, être chaud. Now, he says, we find this verb again in the old French chaloir, which Hatzfeld and Darmestater say is a somewhat old-fashioned term which signifies having an interest in something and is used only impersonally in negative and interrogative sentences. For example, it is found in Il ne m'inchot, it doesn't matter to me. So here, just as being hot ended up with the value of caring about, so singing, chant, having a piece of music in one's mind, may well have evolved in the same way to give the value of care. After receiving this letter, I spoke about it to Paul Vine last night. And he said to me, but certainly it is quite conceivable, without it being wholly incompatible at any rate as a possibility based on the same idea. Maybe we could even point out that melos is the call chant d'appel. For example, it is the shepherd's song, chant, calling back his flock or calling out to other shepherds. It is the song signal. Consequently, mêler moi would mean something like not exactly it appeals to me in my head, but it appeals to me in the sense that it calls out to me or summons me. In our dreadful modern terminology, we would say, it says something to me, ça m'interpelle. This would be more or less what we would have in mêler moi. Anyway, I am telling you this as information. If you are interested in this problem of epimelia, there would be something like a musical secret, a secret of the musical appeal in this notion of care. The second thing also refers to what I was telling you last week with regard to Dumézil's book. I imprudently told you that among all the interesting texts in this book, the central thing is, of course, the coexistence of Dumézil's two commentaries. On the one hand, the commentary on Nostradamus, and on the other, that on Plato. I have tried to read carefully the analysis, commentaries, and reactions which can be found in the press concerning this book, and I have been struck by the fact that some do not mention it at all. Others talk about it, but only about the text on Nostradamus. No one talks about the text on Plato, and a fortiori about the fact that there are two texts, one on Nostradamus and the other on Plato. So, what I am going to tell you here does not represent what Dumézil says himself. It is an interpretation which I am suggesting, which is no doubt not entirely foreign to his thought, but is not his explicit intention present as such in the juxtaposition of the two texts. The first, on Nostradamus, is called a satirical allegorical drama, Soti Nostradamique. The other is called a divertissement. So these are two texts of diversion, but which do not at all have the same status. We should also note that these two studies put to work a particular form of textual analysis, a certain form of analysis of words, a method of cross-checking different kinds of information found in the text, a sort of crossword method which is entirely in line with that employed by Dumézil in his different works of analysis of Indo-European mythologies. And in a sense, there is a sort of testing of his own methods, an obviously ironic testing through the asymmetrical symmetry between these two texts and two analyses. One is a satirical allegory, soti, and the other a divertissement. By taking these two texts of Nostradamus and Plato, Dumézil tested his method, its validity, its rationality, and the demonstrative character of his analysis. He made the test on the basis of two texts which we might say could not be more heterogeneous. That of Nostradamus represents, of course, what we might say is a piece of writing which could not be more suspect to any possible rationalism. It is a prophetic, obscure text weighed down with a series of interpretations which, since the 19th century, have constantly concealed its meaning and value. Dumézil has thus taken the text most alien to the system of modern and European rationality, the system to which he himself belongs. He takes this text and analyzes it with the methods of his rationality. He produces some results, and then he proceeds to take a text by Plato, and from among Plato's texts, the Phaedo, and in the Phaedo, the passage which is both terminal and, of course, central, Socrates' death. And in a sense, we may well say that the meaning and value of Socrates' death is at the heart of Western rationality. After all, Socrates' death, the meaning of this death, is indeed foundational for philosophical discourse, practice, and rationality. For 2,000 years, no commentator has managed to account for what is said in this text concerning the major event which founded Western rationality, Socrates and his death. For what were very precisely Socrates' last words. Socrates' discourse, which founded our rationality, ended with a phrase which no one until now has been able to explain. Dumézil takes up this method again, the method he has employed all his life in the analysis of Indo-European mythology, which he applied to Nostradamus, an example of all that irrationalism may produce in Western discourse. And he employs it in an attempt to resolve this problem of a discourse, a text, a founding event. He shows that all the commentators and historians of philosophy have been absolutely unable to resolve this little enigma of the sacrifice of a cock. I, Socrates, dying, ask for the sacrifice of a cock. So, if we juxtapose these two analyses, that I think we can see how Dumézil has taken, as it were, the greatest possible distance, has marked out the greatest possible surface for the practice of a certain method, the both philosophical and structural method of analysis that he has employed. And this is what I believe is interesting and almost disconcerting in this text. He employs his method on two registers. He puts to work perfectly the ironic register with the analysis of Nostradamus. He shows how far we can go and the limit we may arrive at with such a method. He even says at the end that Nostradamus, like Dumézil, also saw Indo-European tri-functionality. And consequently, he reinscribes his own method in that kind of crucible of the irrationalism of Nostradamus. And then, second register, taking up again and intensifying the same method, he applies it to the crucible of Western rationality, the death of Socrates. He makes an entirely convincing analysis of it, which fills a gap that philosophical reflection never managed to resolve concerning Socrates, the death of Socrates. What is interesting in this book, or one of the interesting things about it, is this interplay between these two texts. There are two short comments I want to make as an appendix to last week's lecture. And now, if you like, let's move on to the text I wanted to analyze, the lash, with regard to the apology, and then following on from this with regard to the credo and the phaedo. I have tried to show you how Socrates introduced a certain mode of verdiction which was distinct from and even explicitly opposed to other modes, those of prophecy, wisdom, and then of teaching, of techne and its transmission. I would like to give you an example of the practice of this Socratic verdiction, the principles, rules, and distinctive characteristics of which appear clearly, I believe, in the trilogy of Socratic paresia, from the dialogue called the Lash. You will, of course, find examples of this paresia, of this verdiction peculiar to Socrates, so different from the verdiction of prophecy, of wisdom, and of teaching, being brought into play in many other of Plato's dialogues, and in all the Socratic dialogues in particular. Nevertheless, I have fixed on the lash for a number of reasons. First, the three fundamental options we encountered in the Apology, and which characterize Socratic truth-telling as opposed to the other modes of verdiction, are clearly formulated and explicitly connected to each other in the Lash. First, the notion of paresia appears quite explicitly and fairly frequently. I think that all of Plato's dialogues, this is the one in which the noun paresia or the verb paresiasteia are used most frequently. At any rate, the noun or the verb appear at the start of the dialogue. They describe the different interlocutors. They also mark the commitment of the different interlocutors with regard to each other. A sort of paresiastic pact is formulated explicitly at the start of the dialogue. And then, at the very heart of the dialogue, at its center, Socrates appears as the person who possesses paresia, who has the right to employ it, and to whom the interlocutors accord the essential right to employ it as he understands it. So, the theme of paresia is emphatically present. Second, you also encounter this second notion of exitasis as way of testing and examining, which I tried to show you was present and important in the apology and characteristic of Socratic veridiction, entailing as well as paresia, a certain procedure of verification, test, investigation, and examination. This notion is present at the very heart of the dialogue of the lash, and before the real and major discussion gets underway, when Socrates' interlocutors accept the game that he proposes, you will see that they are the ones who lay down exitasis, the principle of examination, as the basic rule of the game that Socrates will play and that they agree to play with him. Third, the notion of epimelia, of care, is constant in the dialogue. At any rate, it appears explicitly near the start of the dialogue. It is the care of young people, their education, training, and apprenticeship in the qualities and virtues needed in politics, which gives rise to the dialogue. And when this dialogue closes a bit later, Socrates appears as the only person who can lay claim to this care. He is the one who will have to care for the young, and it is to him that parents will turn so that he cares for their children in the same way that their children must, in turn, have care for themselves. So, throughout the dialogue, we find again the connection, the link, the entwining, as it were, of these three notions. Paresia, as courageous frankness of truth-telling. Exitasis, as practice of the examination and test of the soul. And finally, care, as the objective and end of this paresia, of this interrogatory frankness. This is the first reason for the analyzing the dialogue of the lash. Second, this dialogue is important and typical for the relation it has and maintains with the political scene. Actually, from one point of view, there is nothing exceptional about it. We see Socrates discussing the training of young people, all of them members of the aristocracy from prominent Athenian families and destined, sooner or later, to play their part in the city and to occupy positions with civil or military responsibilities. There is nothing exceptional in this. On the other hand, what is rather odd is that the people with whom Socrates discusses the training of the young are not themselves young. They are adults. And these adults are precisely men who exercise political functions in the period in which the dialogue is supposed to take place. Certainly, we see adults in discussion in other Socratic dialogues, and for the most part, they are people who were or are able to exercise political functions, or who belong to families which play an important part in the city. But here, in the Lash, they are political men who exercise definite functions. At the time they are speaking, they are highly placed historical figures. There is Nicias, who was the main political figure in Athens after Pericles. So, at the end of the 5th century, he commanded the Sicilian expedition, and he will die in Sicily. Lash is an important military leader, someone who, above all, exercised military functions, who was killed at the Battle of Potidæa, but who played an important role. So, we see something here which is not found in practically any other dialogue. Socrates questioning eminent statesmen precisely at the time they are exercising their office. You recall that this was the situation evoked in the Apology when Socrates said that on the instruction of the god who had entrusted him with different missions, he was to go round Athens seeing the different citizens, from the most eminent and important statesmen down to the craftsmen. Here we have precisely this situation. Socrates establishes direct contact with the political scene, and while speaking directly to politicians and thus connecting up directly with political activity, the whole game of the dialogue will be to show how he proposes a game with a different form from that of the political game. He will propose a type of discourse and veridiction which are not political discourse and political veridiction. And he will get the politicians to enter into this other thing. This is the second reason why the Lash seems to me to be interesting and important. The third reason is, of course, that the theme of courage runs through the whole of this dialogue. Since the dialogue's theme is the attempt to define the nature of courage in order, as it were, to tell the truth of courage. But the theme of courage is not just the object of the dialogue. It is also the hallmark of its different characters. Lash, a military leader, especially, and Nicias, both a political and a military leader, are courageous men. And Socrates, moreover, this will be repeated, recalled on at least 2 occasions, had also been a soldier and had demonstrated his physical courage in battle, in war. But even more, each of these men who have been courageous on the battlefield and in civil and military life in defense of the city, also display courage in the dialogue. There is courage, we will see, in admitting some awkward things. The courage of the two generals, the two politicians, Lash and Nicias, in answering Socrates' questions. And there is also Socrates' courage in confronting such important men in the city. So that courage is present at the theme of the dialogue. It is present as civic token, as it were, of the worth of the different characters. And it is also the rule of the moral game within the dialogue in which everything revolves around this question of courage. What is the truth of courage for these men who are truly courageous? But in order to pose this question, in order to confront it properly, one must have the courage of the dialectic. So the intertwining of the themes of courage and truth. The problem of the courage of the truth, posed by truly courageous men who have the courage to confront the question of truth and of the truth of courage, is at the heart of the dialogue. And it is evident that once I had chosen this theme of the courage of the truth as my topic for this year, it was rather difficult not to refer to this text, one of the very few in the whole of Western philosophy, to pose the question of courage, and especially of the courage of truth. What is the ethical relationship between courage and truth? Or to what extent do the ethics of truth entail courage? The theme of the ethics of truth, the question of the moral conditions which enable a subject to have access to the truth and to speak the truth, is, of course, frequently found elsewhere. But we can say that it is central in the construction of this dialogue. We usually find the question of the ethics of truth in the form of the question of the subject's purity or purification. And Western reflection devotes most space to the question in this form. From the Pythagoreans to modern philosophy, there is a whole cathartics of truth. This is the idea that to have access to the truth, the subject must constitute himself in some kind of break with the sensory world. The world of error, interest, and pleasure, with the whole world which, in relation to the eternity of truth and its purity, constitutes the universe of the impure. The transition for the impure to the pure, from the obscure to the transparent, and from the transitory and fleeting to the eternal constitutes, or at any rate marks, the moral trajectory through which the subject can be formed as a subject capable of truth, of seeing and speaking the truth. All this cathartics is found in the Pythagoreans and still in modern philosophy. Because the Cartesian approach is, after all, a cathartic approach. On what conditions will the subject be able to constitute itself as pure gaze, independent of any private interest, and capable of universality in the possession of the cathartic truth. But the cathartic, the subject's purification as condition of being able to be subject of truth, is only one aspect of the ethics of truth. There is another aspect, which is that of the courage of the truth. What type of resolution? What type of will? What type of not only sacrifice, but battle is one able to face in order to arrive at the truth? This struggle for the truth is different from the purification by which one can arrive at the truth. It is no longer the analysis of purification for the truth, but the analysis of the will to truth in its different forms, which may be those of curiosity, battle, courage, resolution, and endurance. Anyway, I think we could find in Plato's text, the lash, one of the elements, one of the starting points for the analysis of this aspect of the ethics of truth. Finally, my last reason for wanting to dwell a little on the lash is that we see marked out in it the starting point for one of the lines of development of Western philosophy. You remember that last year, or 2 years ago, we looked at the Alcibiad together. The Alcibiades is, in many respects, at least in some of its themes, quite close to what could be found in the lash. The Alcibiades also deals with the training of a young man, as will be the case in the lash. It concerns the training which has become all the more necessary by the fact that the young man's parents or tutors were unable to provide him with it. In both the Alcibiades and the lash, it is the relation between education and neglect that founds the principle of care. One must care about the education of young people. All of this is found in the Alcibiades and the lash. Only in the Alcibiades, this theme of education / neglect / care leads fairly quickly to a classic problem, which is, what is it we must take care of? And you remember that the answer given in the Alcibiades is, we must take care of the soul. And then the question arises, what is the soul? What is its nature? And what does taking care of the soul consist? We found here the principle that taking care of the soul is for the soul to contemplate itself, and in so doing, to recognize the divine element, which is precisely what enables it to see the truth. Hence, in a way, the theme of epimelia quickly and directly led on to the principle of the soul's existence and the possibility and necessity for the soul to contemplate itself And finally, it led to the theme of the divine nature of the soul, or at any rate of the divine element in the soul. And in this sense, the Alcibiades, you remember the historical problem of the dialogue was raised, brings together fairly quickly the themes of Plato's early dialogues, like the training, those of the later dialogues, and even Neoplatonist themes. In the Lash, on the other hand, from a fairly similar starting point, from a similar question about the training of young people, the neglect of their education, and the need to be concerned about them, the dialogue follows a completely different line of development. And in one sense, it never ends up at the point to which the Alcibiades leads so quickly. That is to say, the question of what exactly it is that one must take care of is never raised in the Lash. The theme is we must take care of young people, teaching them to take care of themselves. But it is not said what this themselves that they must take care of is exactly. Or rather, it is not said, and yet it is. But precisely it is not said by designating the soul as the immortal reality to which one must turn one's attention and which must be the first and last objective of the care of self. As the dialogue progresses, what is designated as the object one must take care of is not the soul. It is life, bios, that is to say, the way of living. What constitutes the fundamental object of epimelia is this modality, this practice of existence. When we compare the Lash and the Alcibiades, we have the starting point for two great lines of development, of philosophical reflection and practice. On the one hand, philosophy as that which, by prompting and encouraging men to take care of themselves, leads them to the metaphysical reality of the soul, and on the other, philosophy as a test of life, a test of existence, and the elaboration of a particular kind of form and modality of life. Of course, there is no incompatibility between these two themes of philosophy as test of life and philosophy as knowledge of the soul. However, although there is no incompatibility, and although in Plato in particular the two things are profoundly linked, I think nevertheless that we have here the starting point of two aspects, two profiles, as it were, of philosophical activity, of philosophical practice in the West. On the one hand, a philosophy whose dominant theme is knowledge of the soul, and which from this knowledge produces an ontology of the self. And then, on the other hand, a philosophy as test of life, of bios, which is the ethical material and object of an art of oneself. These two major profiles of Platonic philosophy, of Greek philosophy, of Western philosophy, are fairly easily decipherable when we compare the dialogues of the Lash and the Alcibiades with each other. Here again, a brief comment before getting into this dialogue. Last year, I spoke to you about Patoka's book, which has just been translated into French. Patoka was a Czech philosopher who died 5 years ago and whose seminar has been published in France with the title Plato in Europe. It is a very interesting text because it is, I believe, the only one among modern books of the history of philosophy at any rate to give a very important place to the notion of epimeleia, of care, in Plato. He sees Western metaphysics and consequently the destiny of European rationality as being rooted in this notion of care. I recommend this book to you. The only point on which I part from him, while recognizing how interesting his book is as an analysis of epimeleia and care, is that basically he does not envisage epimeleia as care of self, but as care of the soul. That is to say, it seems to me that he envisages this theme only in the form, in the direction, and from the point of view of the knowledge and ontology of the soul. Everything, on the other hand, belonging to the notion and theme of the care of self as test, questioning, examination, and checking of life, disappears in his analysis. And it is precisely this side that I would like to highlight, starting from the Lash, a text in which bios, much more than the soul, appears very clearly as the object of care. And this theme of bios as object of care seems to me to be the starting point for a whole philosophical practice and activity, of which cynicism is, of course, the first example. So, the Lash as starting point for this question of the care of self as test of life and not as knowledge of the soul, I will take 3 moments in this dialogue, 3 particular texts which will enable us to pick out precisely what the relationship between frankness, paresia, free-spokenness, examination, and care may be. The first passage is right at the start, the setting up of the dialogue. This is what could be called the pact of frankness. The second passage I will try to analyze is towards the end of the first third of the text. This is the definition and acceptance of Socratic examination. And finally, the third moment is right at the end of the text, at the conclusion, when we see the interplay between the problem of the need for, the search for the teacher, and the imperative of the care of self. First, then, at the start of the text, the first line of the page, the pact of frankness, right at the start, and even before Socrates has been invited to take part, we see 4 characters. The first is called Lysimachus, and the second, Melesius. Melesius hardly says anything and keeps a low profile. First, these first two, Lysimachus and Melesius, are the characters who spark off the dialogue, as it were, who prompt it, give rise to it, and organize it, precisely because they have a question to put and they would like an answer. They try to organize a dialogue in order to get an answer to their question. And in the dialogue, they are the ones who, from time to time, get the discussion going again. And finally, when the discussion has ended, and despite the fact that, apparently at least, it has been inconclusive, it is they who resolve to do what is called for. We can say, if you like, that these two, Lysimachus and Melesius, are the dialogue's sponsors. The real partners of the dialogue will be the other two characters, Nicias and Lash. Nicias is a political leader who was very important in Athenian life at the end of the 5th century. And Lash is a general. They are the ones who are asked to give their opinion, and Lysimachus and Melesius give them the task of discussing such a serious question. In this presentation of the first four characters, we see straight away and very clearly how the notion of paresia, of free-spokenness, and the notion of care are joined together. I will read you all the beginning. Lysimachus, you have seen this armed athlete fighting Nicias and Lash. Melesius and I have not told you why we asked you to observe this exhibition. We will now give you our reason, for we think we should be frank with you. There are people who ridicule these displays, but who, if you ask them what they think, hide their thoughts and, out of consideration for the person they are talking to, do not say what they think. But we reckon you are good judges in the matter, your opinion fully developed, and you will be frank enough to let us know what it is. You will be able to speak directly, frankly, simply enough in order to make it known to us. That is why we appeal to you to give your views on the question we are going to put to you. This, he says, is what this preamble is leading to. So, Lysimachus and Melesius have taken their two friends, Lash and Nicias, to an exhibition. What is an exhibition? It is a display by a teacher of armed combat, whose name, we learn later, is Stesilos, who shows those present, the spectators, what he can do. First of all, the fact that this is an exhibition is not at all a matter of indifference in all this business. The master of armed combat here, Stesilos, does not confine himself, in fact, to explaining verbally what he can do. We find this bragging in some sophists who appear in other dialogues. Hippias, for example, explains verbally what he can do, although he is no doubt unable to carry out everything he boasts of. Anyway, here we have someone who presents himself as a teacher, a sort of sophist who more specialized than arms drill, and he demonstrates what in fact he can do. He puts himself to the test, and it is this test that Lysimachus and Melesius, Lash and Nicias watch. They witness it. In this way, they are not in danger of being taken in by the flattery of persuasive rhetoric. They will be able to appraise and judge with their own eyes, and the dialogue will recall what Stesislas can do several times. We have witnesses, eyewitnesses of this. You can see that already. We are in a dimension which is not one of verbal presentation, of the ability to present verbally what one is supposed to be able to do. We are in the domain of the test, but of the direct visual test. Second, there is also what take place, which Lysimachus recalls. Not only did they go to see this exhibition with their own eyes in order to test it, and in which the master of armed combat tested himself, but Lysimachus and Melesius were careful not to tell Lash and Nicias why they had taken them, so that the test would be pure and clear-cut. They brought Nicias and Lash before the exhibition itself, before the thing itself. They did not tell them why they had invited them, so that, in actual fact, Nicias and Lash can, without prejudice, as it were, accurately evaluate what Stesislas was doing. Third, the text shows that yet another precaution was taken. Lysimachus and Melesius chose to take these two men to this exhibition without saying why, because Lash and Nicias are, on the one hand, conversant with this topic. They are in fact military leaders, people who have exercised military responsibilities, and on the other, they are not the kind of people to hide what they think. And while it is true that some people are the kind who laugh at what they see but then lack the courage to say all the bad things they are thinking, Nicias and Lash, after seeing the demonstration, without prejudice, and without even knowing why they have been taken to see it, will have enough character to say what they think without any disguise. You see, therefore, the series of precautions taken to set up the conditions, the zone of truth-telling. A well-protected, guaranteed site for the emergence of truth was needed. And whatever might be deceitful in discourse had to be kept away from this site of truth, of the emergence of truth. So, we will see the thing itself. The spectators are silent, and Lysimachus puts the question frankly to Nicias and Lash, from whom a frank answer is expected. Parrhesia is in fact the keynote of the dialogue, which will take place thanks to these precautions. What is the object, the raison d'etre of all these precautions? Why is it so important that Parrhesia operates here? In the new question which will be put, it is because this question, which is so weighty that one must carefully set out this zone of Parrhesia, is that of the care to be given to children, of how one is to take care of them. In fact, Lysimachus explains to Lash and Nicias, you have sons and have no doubt taken care of them. Either you have taken care of them and have therefore thought about what is best for them, or you have not been concerned about your sons, in which case it is high time that you were. At any rate, you certainly have something to say about how to take care of children. In any case, it is a matter of answering this question. Should we, Lysimachus and Melesius, and possibly you, Nicias and Lash, really entrust our sons to this master of armed combat, whose trials and exercises we have just seen directly? Is the teaching they can get from him and that he give them worthwhile? Lysimachus and Melesius put this question, but as soon as they have asked it, they had a particular reason for having done so. They give the reason why, on the one hand, they are so greatly concerned about their children's education, and why, being concerned about it, they turn to Nicias and Lash as undoubtedly more competent than themselves. Why? Well, Lysimachus says, on behalf of himself and Melesius, the reason we are worried about our children and ask your advice about their education is this. When we, Melesius and I, look at our own lives, we realize that we have not done anything good or outstanding. Certainly, we belong to important families. Our ancestors had great fame, and our fathers were destined for great things in the city. But it has to be acknowledged that ultimately we have led insignificant and rather mediocre lives without any of those glorious feats, which are precisely what might authorize us to advise our children on how they should conduct themselves. In any case, we are not that type of example that children may and should have before their eyes so as to develop their own character and establish their own existence. Our ancestors, they say, may indeed have been important and played a major role in the city, but we have not done so. And Lysimachus immediately adds, but in fact, if we really have led such insignificant lives, is this not precisely because our ancestors, our fathers, attended to the affairs of others? They were so absorbed in the city's affairs, so concerned to deal with ta ton allons pragmata, the affairs of others, that they could not but neglect us. And it is because we were neglected in our childhood, because no one took care of us, that we have led unremarkable lives. This neglect of Melesius and Lysimachus when they were children, which was due to the political success of their parents, explains both why Lysimachus and Melesius are so anxious for their own children not to be neglected, and also why they, who are such insignificant and dull examples for their children, turn to the outstanding men, Nicias and Lash, who certainly have things to say about the education of children. Now, when they have given this explanation concerning epimelia, the word occurs in these passages at least a half dozen times. After having explained why they are so concerned about the care to give their children, they point out that they do not say this without some feeling of shame. For it is not pleasant to confess to Nicias and Lash that their lives' lack of brilliance embarrasses them and makes them particularly concerned about the care to be given their children. They are thus obliged to give this explanation of their own concern. They are obliged to give them this explanation overcoming their own shame and embarrassment. And to what do they have to resort in order to do this? Well, to parrhesia, to frankness, free-spokenness. This is what Lysimachus says. It is worth recounting how this idea came to us, of turning to you for advice on the education of our children. Though it's a bit of a long story, as I was just saying to you, I will be frank. So, each of us finds some fine actions in his father's life that he can recount to young children. Actions performed in war and peace, actions concerning the city's affairs. But we too personally have nothing to tell. We are somewhat ashamed before our sons, and we reproach our fathers. We gave us a free rein in our youth. You see that the themes of epimeleia, of the care one must have for children, and parrhesia are directly linked. They are obliged to call on parrhesia, on their courage to tell the truth, in order to pose the question of the care of children, since they themselves were neglected and are unable to provide any examples. That is what I wanted to say about these first lines of the dialogue. I would like now to move on to the more important part of the dialogue, that is to say, the definition of Socratic examination. After Milesius and Lysimachus' invitation, Nicias and Lash reply favorably to the request. They will give their views on the display they have witnessed, the kind of show or exhibition Stesislaus has given of his abilities as teacher of the art of armed combat. First, Nicias and then Lash give their views, and what needs to be stressed is that this confrontation of the opinions of Nicias and Lash on the teacher of armed combat takes exactly the same form as a political discussion. We are dealing with a sort of analogon of the political arena, of an assembly in which the two partners develop their own opinions in turn in a continuous discourse. On the one hand, Nicias finds the teacher's lessons useful. They are useful because they provide good practice for fighting. They are good exercises also, inasmuch as they can initiate young people into the art of fighting and ultimately into the whole system of strategy. This is good practice also because it can develop the moral qualities of courage and boldness in the young people who will have to defend their homeland. These exercises are even able to develop physical qualities, not only of strength and endurance, but also a kind of beauty of posture and action, which Nicias says is also important. Lash discourse, on the other hand, criticizes the exercises. They only demonstrate the teacher's abilities in precisely those cities where there are scarcely any well-trained soldiers. And then, the second reason, and this is very important in contrast with Socrates, as we will see shortly, as a general, Lash has seen how this teacher of the art of fighting conducted himself in battle. He had shown himself to be both not very courageous and above all very clumsy, so that the fighters were doubled up with laughter when they saw how he was unable to put his own lessons into practice. Nicias' discourse and Lash discourse continue and oppose each other, just as in political sparring or physical confrontation. It is then, after the confrontation of these two speeches and the resulting impasse, that Socrates, already present but silent, is appealed to. As always in dialogues of this kind, Socrates' intervention signals not only a recapitulation of the theme in a different form, but in fact a completely different way of proceeding in the discussion. What transformation does Socrates' intervention bring about? There are three. The simplest is carried out first of all with the least difficulty. It is, as it were, the transition from the political to what could be called the technical model of discussion. We have seen that the political model of discussion is two characters coming forward, one after the other, as if they were taking the floor to support their thesis. That it is this political judicial model which has been at work until now is very clearly indicated by Lysimachus when we arrive at the impasse. After hearing both Nicias and Lash, Lysimachus says, "It is quite clear that there is a divergence, a disagreement in your boule, in your council, referring to the city's institutions. Nicias and Lash," he says, "have given opposite opinions. We must therefore ask Socrates, who is present, but has kept quiet until now, who he will vote for. Is the stone the ballot? So Lysimachus asks Socrates, "Who will you vote for?" You can see that all of this refers to the political model. Now, replying to Lysimachus' question, "Who gets your vote?" Socrates straight away explicitly rejects this model, saying, "Can the law of the majority, of the greatest number, really be applied here? What is actually involved? It is a question." And he employs the word of techne. And it is a question of techne. And consequently, what should prevail is not the greatest number, but technique. What kind of technique? Well, precisely what we are looking for is, he says, and we should absolutely hold on to the word, a technikos peri suki therapian, a technician of the care, of the therapy of the soul. Now, how can we know if someone is competent in the field of techne in general, and actually in the field of this techne? It is clear that if we speak as a simple voter, it is enough for someone to cast their vote for or against an opinion, when what is involved is a problem of techne, rather than the political arena or political themes. Then two criteria must be met for a useful and effective approach to someone. First, we will acknowledge someone as competent in the field of techne if we know who taught him, and if these teachers were good and able to train good students. The question of the teacher is the first criterion, and the second could be called the criterion of works. Has the person who claims to be competent and wants to give his views, or the person to whom we turn as someone competent, had only good teachers, and above all, has he been able to do something, and something worthwhile? We may even accept that he has been able to do something worthwhile without a teacher. In any case, these are the two necessary criteria. These two criteria, either together or one without the other, are indispensable when we are considering someone's opinion in the field of techne. So, we can bid farewell to the political arena and its procedures, in which two opinions are opposed on every point, and voting decides between them according to the law of the greatest number. We can appeal to something else, which is the criterion of competence, resting on two poles of the teacher's quality on the one hand and the quality of works on the other. This becomes apparent when Socrates says, likewise, Lash and Nicias, since Lysimachus and Melius ask for your advice on how to make the souls of their sons as perfect as possible. If we claim to have learned this art, we must tell them what teachers we have had, and prove that these teachers, praiseworthy men, have skillfully treated young people before passing on their teaching to us. If any of us claim not to have had a teacher, a perfectly legitimate possibility, but can at least show us his works, he must tell us what individuals, Athenians or foreigners, slaves or freemen, have become men who are recognized as being praiseworthy thanks to him. If we cannot do this, let us ask our friends to address themselves to others, and not expose us to the risk of incurring the greatest responsibility of having corrupted their sons. You can see that we have passed from a political type of veridiction, the scene of an assembly, a council, a boule, with conflicting opinions and a vote, to something else. This other scene is that of technical veridiction, which I have spoken to you about and which you can see is well defined here, as we saw it was last week. It basically rests on the traditional character of a knowledge handed down from teacher to disciple in manifesting itself in works. The veridiction of technique of teaching is authorized by this double relation to expertise and works. But, and here we will see a second transformation. Socrates avoids the issue just when he has established the technical, as opposed to the political scene. Just when we think that, since it is a question of the technique of the soul, we are now coming to the question of Socrates' teachers and Socrates' works. He avoids the question and says, but as for myself, I have never had a teacher because I could not afford to pay for one. I was too poor. And I don't have the ability to teach others. So you should not turn to me if you are really looking for someone skilled who can tell you how to raise your children. And straight away, he suggests turning the question of competence back to Nicias and Lash. In fact, he says, these are people who are wealthy enough to get teachers. And anyway, they have lived long enough and experienced enough to know what they could teach young people. So we are now in a completely different scene. It is no longer the political, the technical scene, with the same characters reappearing thanks to Socrates' ploy, which has shifted the scene, but from which he has exempted himself as interlocutor. Again, we find Nicias and Lash. We turn to them. We ask them to speak. Only Socrates has put a hitch in the new scene he has just established. He has introduced a hitch in this technical question, in which Nicias and Lash are, as it were, put back on the stage. The hitch is this. He says, since it is now a question of competence, and since Nicias and Lash are to speak as experts, since they still have to demonstrate and give evidence of their competence before we ask them for their views, what qualifies them to speak on the question we put to them? We will therefore have to question them on who their teachers were, how they learned what they know, and what their works have been in this domain. Consequently, Socrates proposes not only a change of scene from the political to the technical, but a shift, a transformation of the procedure. Lash and Nicias are not simply invited to give their opinion because they are qualified. They are invited and pressured into playing a game in which they will have to reply to questions. They will be questioned on what qualifies them to speak on this technical question of the art of Suki's therapia, the care of the soul. Lysimachus, a sponsor of the dialogue, accepts this form of questioning proposed by Socrates. He accepts, in fact, Socrates' proposal to change the procedure. And he makes the following proposal to Nicias and Lash. It seems to me, Nicias and Lash, that Socrates is right. It is up to you to decide if you are agreeable to being questioned and answering. Obviously, Melesius and I will be delighted to hear you give your views in answer to Socrates' questions. Because, just as I said at the start, we have asked you to give us your views. It is because we think that you must have thought about this problem, especially because, like us, you have sons who are of an age when they are completing their education. So, if you have no objection, say you will engage in this search with Socrates, asking and answering each other's questions, for as Socrates says, for us this is the most serious question. See then if this project is agreeable to you. So you see, there is a shift from the political to the technical scene, and within the latter, a return to Nicias and Lash, but now in the position of people who are going to be questioned. And it is here that the third change is situated, a change which introduces and marks the emergence of the specifically Socratic game and Socratic paresia in the form which I will try to show you shortly. He has therefore transformed the political model into a reference to technique and competence. Second, with regard to this question of competence, he has proposed and got agreement to the rule that these two partners in the discussion will not make direct use of their competence, but will first of all be invited to give an account of it by answering the questions Socrates will put to them. Only here we can now come to a third transformation, which is the most important. Actually, in proposing this reference to technique and this procedure of questioning, Socrates looks like he is merely drawing his two partners into the domain of technique, and so of inviting them to point out their place, as it were, their role or their game in the passing on of knowledge by the teacher. And when he seems simply to be asking for their qualifications for passing on expertise and knowledge, he is basically devising something completely different. And under the pretext of questioning them about the teachers who can authenticate their competence and their views, he will impose a completely different game on them. One which is neither that of politics, of course, nor even that of technique, but which will be the game of paresia and ethics, the game of paresia oriented towards the problem of ethos. First, how does this Socratic game emerge in the dialogue? That is to say, how is it discovered and accepted by the partners? Second, how is this game described and defined? And in what does it consist? And third, what authorizes Socrates to perform this role of ethical parrhesia? That's the end of the first hour of Lecture 4 from The Courage of the Truth. Lectures given at the College of France by Michel Foucault, 22nd February 1984.